Good evening, everyone. My name is Brendan Cahill. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs here at Fordham University, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you tonight to this Ireland at Fordham Humanitarian Lecture Series. I'm especially thrilled to welcome my dear friend, Dr. Jemilah Mahmood, whom I've known and worked with for so many years. The Institute was created at Fordham in 2002 to act as a bridge between academia and the humanitarian sector. And we achieve this through humanitarian training, through research, through our gallery and our publications. And I would urge you to look at our other events and our training programs. But tonight we're really here for this special evening and this special talk. I would like to ask my colleague Martin Gallagher of the Permanent Mission of Ireland to the United Nations to welcome Dr. Mahmood. Thank you very much and welcome.
I see your speech is here, but I'm not going to give any spoilers. So good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Gallagher. I'm the Humanitarian Councillor at the Irish Permanent Mission to the United Nations. I'd like to thank Brendan for the welcome, and thank you all for joining us here for what is the third address of the Ireland at Fordham Humanitarian Lecture Series. And I'm really pleased to be back here at Fordham's Lincoln Centre campus this evening. We were last here in September with President Higgins for what was, I think, could be described as a stimulating lecture in diplomatic terms. But that's what this collaboration between Ireland and the IIHA is really all about. It's about inviting eminent speakers to tackle difficult questions ranging from climate justice to conflict and hunger. And what we want to do is we want to explore some of the challenges that are facing policymakers and humanitarians as they deliver life-saving support and protection to people in need in some of the worst crises in the world. I suppose, sadly, some would say that the challenges have never been greater for humanitarians. And I've been around this sort of game for about 20 years, and I certainly see sort of changes in the context. There are 170 million people or so in need of humanitarian assistance this year. And the context in which the assistance that they need is being provided is changing. And a number of the challenges that really stand out is that humanitarian crises are becoming more complex and they're becoming more protracted. And as I said, when I was around sort of 15, 20 years ago, the big crises were really like the Asian tsunami, the Haiti earthquakes. So they were, sort of natural disasters were leading to huge humanitarian needs. Today, the vast majority of humanitarian needs is because of conflict. And that's in places like Syria and Yemen. And those conflicts are dragging on for decades, or for a decade at least. And that creates another challenge. That challenge is reaching those in need. And we see that humanitarian space is shrinking. It's more difficult for humanitarians to do their job and to reach those most in need. And humanitarian principles are more and more questioned. And that leads to a further challenge for humanitarians or for humanitarian action, particularly where terrorism or insurgents are involved, and that's a sort of inexplicable criminalization of humanitarians as they go about their work, and that's often because of counter-terrorism measures or sanctions regimes that are sort of not fit for purpose. But whether it's by design or by ignorance, it's inexcusable that humanitarians are sort of targeted in that additional way in their work. So I suppose all of these challenges, there are many, many more, but these ones in particular underline the importance of trust in humanitarian action between donors and the humanitarian agencies that we fund, between national governments and the agencies that are working in their countries, and most importantly, I suppose, between the humanitarian community and the host communities, the people that they're actually serving. So faced with these challenges, it's clear that the international community needs to improve delivery of humanitarian assistance. And I think accountability, trust, and empowering local organizations are at the heart of that. And I have to mention that Ireland is a candidate for a seat on the UN Security Council, elected seat for the years 2021, 2022. And, you know, as we look forward to that, hopefully to that period on the Security Council, these challenges are deeply worrying. And we're thinking a lot about how, you know, if we, you know, have the opportunity, we might want to address them, because humanitarian action will definitely be a priority for us. So for this reason, with Brendan, I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Mahmood to be with us tonight to speak about some of these things. Dr. Mahmood, you have invaluable experience to share with us on the issue of how to address this important subject of trust, or the trust deficit in humanitarian action. I think as a representative of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, national societies, who are often, almost always, the very first responders when disaster strikes or when conflict erupts, there's probably no one more appropriate to remind us of the importance of building public confidence and going local. And just a little bit on your background. Dr. Mahmood is the founder of Mercy Malaysia, which she led from 1999 to 2009. She's also led the Humanitarian Response Branch at UNFPA, being a senior fellow at Khazanah National Berhad in Malaysia's Khazanah Research and Investment Strategy Division, and a senior visiting research fellow at the Humanitarian Futures Programme at King's College in London. And before joining IFRC in 2016, she served as chief of the World Humanitarian Summit Secretariat here in New York, a very important role that helped reshape the humanitarian system and the humanitarian community to try and meet some of these challenges. So as I said, with this background, no one better to address us this evening on the subject of the trust deficit in humanitarian action. Does going local address it? So I'll now turn over the floor to Dr. Mahmood, and I think we'll give you a round of applause before you even start.
Thank you very much, Martin and Brendan, for such a warm welcome. Good afternoon, everyone, and really glad you all made it through the rain. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I just want to thank the Permanent Mission of Ireland and Fordham University for giving me this honor of speaking today as part of your Ireland at Fordham lecture series. I know I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, since this series has previously brought two of the globe's most important humanitarian diplomats to the stage. Last April, former President Mary Robinson spoke about climate justice with the usual passion and urgency that she has, an issue to which she has contributed so much. And last October, President Michael Higgins brought you an equally strong call for action on the role of public intellectuals in defending some of our most life-saving ideas, from humanitarianism itself to refugee protection. I can assure you of one thing, that like my predecessors, I was partially educated by the Irish, and my headmistress, a feisty 90-year-old Sister Enda Ryan, deserves much credit for my achievements, and I'm sure she will be very proud of me today. While it's hardly likely that I may ever have the chance to take my turn as the President of Ireland, but like the former esteemed speakers, I'm also here with a call to action for you. In other words, no one is walking out of here free of your shared responsibility to help us solve one of the biggest threats currently facing humanitarian action. The threat I want to talk about is not as obvious as the international community's terrifying failure to take the steps so obviously needed to halt global warming, or the crazy way that our debates are turning vulnerable migrants and refugees into scapegoats instead of people who need and deserve our protection. But it may be just as damaging. They never listen, so I don't trust them, told to us by a young migrant woman who had spent some time in a transit center in Italy. You make promises without delivering anything, a community member told us in Beni, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the epicenter of the current Ebola epidemic. We have a trust problem, or a deficit, in the humanitarian sector, and we all need to fix it. We in the Red Cross and Red Crescent are so concerned about this that we devoted a major part of our recent quadrennial international conference with the states to address this. As you can see from the title of my speech, I have an idea about what we can do, and it involves paying the right attention to going local. To begin with, I need you to keep these three things in mind. First, trust. It's often seen as something warm and fuzzy. Trust makes us feel safe. It makes us feel comfortable. But the truth is that trust is about taking some risks. It is a leap of faith. This is why it can be lost so quickly. Trust in long-standing institutions is not necessarily eternal. It is also often hard to come by when it is time for fundamental change. Secondly, trust is a matter of life and death. If the right people don't trust us as humanitarians, we can very literally die, and so can they. On the other hand, if the humanitarian sector, including our donors, can't find a way to start trusting the right people, then humanitarianism itself may die. Who are these people? Those we hope to help, and also those who want to help within their own communities. This is what I mean by going local. Finally, trust is like water. Too little, and we die. Too much, and we drown. We absolutely need trust in the humanitarian sector, but it is not a standalone. Prophet Muhammad reminded his companions, trust in God, but first tie up your camel. Former US President Ronald Reagan used to say, trust, but verify. So trust is about ensuring adequate risk assessment, being accountable and finding a way to balance and measure both. So this begs the question, how much should we trust? Let me start by setting the scene. Why do I claim that trust is so important to humanitarian action? It is, as President Higgins told us in October, that humanitarianism is basically an idea, a story we tell ourselves, and stories only work if we suspend our disbelief. The historian Yuval Harari has explained in his book *Sapiens* that the shift of human beings from small family social units to nations and ideologies gathering millions owes a great deal to our ability to invent and then believe in stories. In other words, having common imagined realities that allow us to believe in invisible constructs, such as limited liability companies and nations, as a way of organizing ourselves. Our economy is based on these kinds of helpful fictions. It is only because we all believe in the worth of currency and in the stability of markets that these things continue to function. Over many decades, we have also built up a shared concept of reality for humanitarian action, with the notion that there is such a thing as global solidarity, rules in war, and principles to which humanitarians will abide. This is closely linked to the history of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, which I have had the honor of and privilege to be a part of just over 4 years. Born more than 150 years ago in an Italian battlefield, and now represented through 14 million volunteers in 192 countries around the world, both our individual national societies and their international components, my organization, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, as well as the International Committee of Red Cross, are among the most trusted brands in the world. But trust doesn't necessarily last forever. We can fall out of love with even the oldest and most traditional imagined realities. Certainly, we have seen many market crashes where that mutual belief, as well as huge amounts of imagined money, suddenly went up in a puff of smoke. Along the same lines, we are currently about 10 years, perhaps starting with the Arab Spring, into a febrile period where public belief in many core aspects of the system is disappearing around the world. We see unprecedented doubt in government, in multilateral institutions, in the media, in globalization and trade, and even in science. About 2 weeks ago, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called this global wave of mistrust one of the four horsemen that endanger 21st century progress and imperil 21st century possibilities. As you may know, the Edelman Company has been running annual public surveys in several dozen countries on trust issues for the last 20 years, finding a major fall-off in public confidence in institutions such as government, large corporations, media, and even NGOs. There has, however, been, thankfully, a modest uptick in the last few years. This year's report showed a continued trust inequity gap, with the most highly educated segments of society showing much higher confidence in NGOs, the media, and other institutions than the public at large. Last year's report specified that only 1 in 5 people, educated or not, believed that the system was working for them, and over 70% were ready for change. In the West in particular, the politics of many countries have embraced change of unprecedented scope, with large swathes of voters essentially endorsing Mark Zuckerberg's motto of moving fast and breaking things, and we have seen the consequences of that. As people reject official sources of information, they are increasingly turning to search engines and social media to inform themselves. In the absence of accepted referees of truth, new imagined realities can easily form in the algorithmic echo chambers that fly in the face of facts rather than building on them, sometimes based on who is shouting loudest. This environment is a new test for the traditional tools of the humanitarian sector. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and many other humanitarian actors have placed a great deal of faith in our humanitarian principles as our central tool for maintaining trust. This is particularly true for the fundamental principle of neutrality. Our statutes describe neutrality as indispensable for enjoying the confidence at all. For us, this means not only refusing to take sides in war, but also avoiding controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. In his commentary on our fundamental principles written over 50 years ago, the ICRC legal guru Jean Pictet pointed out, even then, 50 years ago, there was a rising tendency for many to see neutrality as a cop-out, as essentially siding with the status quo and insisting that everyone must take a stand. He said that, and I quote, "The Red Cross must make it clear to those concerned that it constitutes an exception at a time when, throughout the world, things are becoming more and more politicized. The Red Cross cannot compromise itself in this wild turmoil. It has therefore confined itself to fields of action in which there are no such disputes, or at least should not be, and aims at carrying out tasks which rarely virtually unanimous support." Unquote. This has always been a hard balance. So hard, in fact, that some of our peers, such as Oxfam, have formally signed off from neutrality. Others interpret it so narrowly that their advocacy messaging stops just short of what one could expect from a political party. But there is a clear price to this. Governments in crisis-affected countries increasingly see humanitarians as the vanguard of political meddling, using crisis situations when controls are weak as an opportunity and excuse to push a partisan agenda. In many recent crises, from Sudan to Myanmar, Syria to North Korea, the National Red Cross or Red Crescent Society has found itself the only lonely humanitarian actor allowed access to many of the people most in need. In other countries, like here in the US, the National Society is the only non-governmental actor allowed regular access to major governmental committees on emergency response. Neutrality is an important reason why. And like trust itself, one does not easily get neutrality back if it is ever set aside. On the other hand, it is abundantly clear that our current and potential future young volunteers are now more than ever expecting us to raise our voice, particularly on climate change, for the dignified treatment of vulnerable migrants, for gender justice and inclusivity. To a large extent, the aspects of these issues where we have the most expertise, such as in the human impacts of climate change or climate disasters, and the humanitarian needs of vulnerable migrants, fit well within PICTE's exception for issues about where there are no disputes, or at least should not be. You are starting to hear a louder voice from us on these issues where there should not be dispute. For example, in September last year, we released a report on the cost of doing nothing, which shows that if we do not change the ongoing rise in global warming, the number of people needing humanitarian assistance due to weather-related events is likely to double to 200 million per year by 2050. And that even by 2030, when we hope to achieve sustainable development goals, the global humanitarian spend on such events will have already skyrocketed to at least $20 billion a year. In December, we confronted state parties to the Geneva Conventions at our quadrennial international conference with a series of scenarios about the rising tolls of humanitarian crisis driven by the climate that our members are already struggling to address, and obtained their endorsement of calls to strengthen and modernize disaster laws and policies to account for climate change and to leave no one behind. Likewise, migration is among the most contested political issues in a significant number of countries. But without taking a stance on whether states should promote more or less migrants, we are speaking up for their dignity and rights, and in particular for their safety and access to essential services. We raised this consistently in the recent development of the compacts on migration and on refugees. At our recent statutory meetings in December, the entire movement adopted a statement on migration and our common humanity, presented to the state parties of the Geneva Conventions at our international conference. We are doing our best to thread the needle between neutrality and standing up, but we know that we will continue to be challenged to do more. Maintaining trust with the activist, public, and volunteer base may come to be directly at odds with maintaining trust with states. Yet we need both to do our work. As challenging as that may be, just staying true to our principles will not be enough to maintain trust in the humanitarian sector. While they disagree on many things, both our individual and government donors are worried about value for money and the possibility that money will be wasted or even go awry. These concerns are common sense and nothing new. They are absolutely right that this money must be spent transparently, wisely, and well. But the ever-rising level of anxiety about these issues and the way we balance them against our other kinds of risks is a drag on our ability to save lives. Just a few years ago, on the occasion of the World Humanitarian Summit, donors and agencies signed a far-reaching grand bargain with the intention to finally correct some of the longest-standing and most costly absurdities in the way the global system functions. The flame of that moment's courage is still alive, but it is struggling under heavy headwinds. On the donor side, these commitments included reducing the earmarking of pledges to reduce top-down rigidity in how we respond to needs, the provision of multi-year funding to allow us to address the long-term issues and protect the crises, and the reduction of donor reporting burdens. As of last year, multi-year and unearmarked funding had grown overall in the sector, but only by a few percentage points. according to Development Institute's or Development Initiative's Global Humanitarian Assistance Report, which I highly encourage you to read. At the IFRC itself, nearly 70% of pledges to our 2018 appeals were still earmarked, and less than 20% of our pledges overall were for more than 1 year. We were also required to produce over 1,700 separate donor reports. That is a lot of time that could have been put to much better use. We will do what we must to keep the trust of the individuals and governments that fund us, or money will stop flowing and the people in need will suffer. But what about those people we hope to help? It turns out their trust is even more important. Let's take the case of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. First announced in August 2018, to date, over 3,000 cases have been identified. This is an area suffering from over 2 decades of conflict, where basic services are already scarce. And people have already been dying from many less headline-catching diseases, such as malaria and pneumonia. They don't trust the authorities, and they don't trust outsiders. As voiced to Marie-Rosaline Belizaire, a WHO doctor, people said to her, they say, we are in a war zone. We have been killed, so many people, so many times. So why are you coming now? Now overlay on this extreme strangeness of Ebola, with its grisly symptoms, the bizarre spaceman uniforms, the shocking separateness that we need from the bodies of loved ones, and the terrors of quarantine. We had already learned many lessons about this from our experience in 2014. Excuse me. Frightened, distrustful people do not seek help when they are sick. They do not report deaths. Some even attack their helpers. When the virus first appeared to the city of Butembo in DRC, a 25-year-old carpenter was exposed to an identified case. Health workers asked him to be tested. He said, I had heard many rumors about how those who left for the Ebola treatment center died. So I fled the center and went back home. When many people feel like this, you can never contain an epidemic. Building on our experience in West Africa, the DRC Red Cross organized volunteers to undertake safe and dignified burials. Hundreds of volunteers regularly collect information from the neighbors and communities about rumors, attitudes, fears, and complaints. With help from the Center for Disease Control here in the US, we analyzed this data to get a granular sense of what people were thinking. In some communities, we heard that people thought that our burial teams were replacing the bodies with rocks and then selling the organs. They thought that people transported to Ebola treatment centers were injected with poison and then died. With our community engagement and accountability programs, we found ways to address these fears. For instance, by ensuring that family members could see their loved ones being prepared and at the time of burial. Taking simple measures like changing from an opaque to a translucent body bag does much to dispel doubt and mistrust. Yes, we listened, but more importantly, we acted. In late October 2018, only 28% of reports of Ebola deaths were coming to the DRC Red Cross from the communities themselves, with the rest coming from the treatment centers. After extensive community-based information and education work, by February 2019, 81% of our calls were coming from the communities. This is an important success, and after 20,000 burials, we feel we are making a huge difference in containing this disease, a good thing as the coronavirus seizes global attention. But we can never be complacent. There have been attacks against our National Society volunteers as recently as last month, when 2 were seriously injured. We just have to keep listening. During my visit to Erbil in Iraq last year, I sat and listened to the lamentations of a group of women from local organizations. They shared some examples on the lack of ability of international donors and agencies to really engage, to listen, to understand, and trust the views of people. One of them is so hard for me to forget, as if it wasn't so sad, would be terribly funny. A UN agency wanted to work in a community and decided, with obviously little consultation, that rearing egg-producing hens would be an effective way to restore livelihoods. There were a few problems. Many in the community had no experience with rearing hens, were unclear what the hens were for, and beautiful, fluffy white chickens, or hens, imported from Ukraine, yes, you heard me right, Ukraine, costing probably 5 times more than a local hen, finally arrived. Within a week, half was slaughtered for meals, another significant portion sold off, leaving a suspicious community wondering if humanitarian workers were making money on the side through a hen racketeering business. Ground Truth Solutions, an NGO with whom we have been partnering, has been surveying aid recipients in crisis settings around the world. In a survey of over 7,000 people in 7 countries, it found that many, over 70%, were willing to say that they trusted humanitarians. And this is a good thing. But when they dug deeper, they find them feeling mainly disempowered and disappointed. 75% of them said that the aid they received did not meet their needs. This shows that even if we are saving lives, we are obviously not listening well enough to what people want and need. This brings me to the flip side of this issue. How can we expect the people we serve to trust us if we are not willing to trust them? The Grand Bargain promised not only some change in this area, but a revolution, a participatory revolution, it was called. We are nowhere near there yet. It isn't that we don't talk to people affected by crises. We're constantly asking them questions. In big operations with multiple responders, affected communities sometimes get assessed over and over again by different agencies. However, we are still not good enough at actually listening, and even when we do listen, we often do not act on what we hear. And worse still, we don't deliver what we promise. For example, among those who are currently living in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh after fleeing Myanmar, we found in 2018 that 43% sold their aid that they received on the market. The following year, the number went up to 59%. This is in part an argument for providing cash rather than our stock food and non-food items, another one of our commitments in the Grand Bargain to increase the utilization of cash. Giving cash, particularly unconditional cash, is our way of trusting that people are smart enough to address their most important needs. A great deal of research has been done on this, and it fully supports the case for trust. This is now widely agreed by donors and agencies alike, and the volume of cash programming is rapidly increasing. As of 2018, it was estimated that USD 4.7 billion, with an increasing proportion in the form of cash rather than vouchers, has risen from 55% in 2015 to 78% in 2018, though still representing only 16% of the overall aid spent. Within our own network, the Turkish Red Crescent is currently leading the world's largest cash assistance program in coordination with authorities and support from us at IFRC and funded by ECHO. The IFRC and our network of national societies itself delivers 25% of the entire global cash program annually, and this figure is rising. However, while donor agencies have mainly accepted the case for cash, a distrustful electorate and press in some donor markets are still making ominous noises based on disproven assumptions that recipients are likely to waste cash, or that cash is more likely to be the object of fraud. Still, cash is not a panacea. True community engagement and accountability is about more than just the type of aid we give. It is about our readiness to adapt what we do more generally to the needs of affected people, as they themselves see them, and not just respond to our own assumptions. We need to go beyond the suggestion box to real transformation. Let me give you another example closer to here, just across the border. Indigenous communities are the most affected by many of the natural hazard-related disasters affecting Canada every year. The Grand Chief of the Prince Albert Grand Council in Saskatchewan, which represents 22 Indigenous communities, said that for a long time, the communities he represents did not trust the Canadian Red Cross because they perceived it as an arm of the government, with whom they had, of course, historical grievances. However, all this changed when the Prince Albert area was affected by severe flooding a few years ago. Many Indigenous communities disagreed with the evacuation plans proposed by the government and therefore evacuated on their own in a different area than the one designated by the government. The Canadian Red Cross still provided these communities with cash assistance and other support, even if they were not officially registered with the government. This was a turning point for the Grand Chief, where he saw that the Canadian Red Cross was willing to meet them on their own terms, even if the government wasn't. Since then, Prince Albert Grand Council has signed a historical agreement with the Canadian Red Cross, through which communities will be able to participate in the work and work in the planning of evacuations. The Vice President of Canadian Red Cross said, "We recognize that communities know the communities best." In major emergencies, however, we are still often on autopilot, copying and pasting from one plan to another without taking the time up front to engage. Like many of our partners, we are trying hard to break out of this pattern. In December, we formally adopted a harmonized and ambitious approach to community and accountability that will apply across our Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Donors need to help the humanitarian community to succeed with this. This means finding ways to allow for more flexibility in midstream changes of plan. Aid organizations need to go beyond rigid log frames, but to be able to listen, adjust, deliver impact, and learn. With all the best intentions, efforts to do this are often still too difficult to be effective. We need to address our trust gap between international and local responders. When we were preparing the World Humanitarian Summit, we carried out what I believe is the largest and most diverse ever consultation with a wide variety of people about the global humanitarian system. We connected with over 23,000 people in 151 countries. A consistent message that we heard throughout the consultations was the need for the international community essentially to wake up to the enormous capacity of governments and civil society in states impacted by crises, particularly in situations of non-conflict disasters, where we expect all to be pulling in the same direction. Around the same time, the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian financing concluded that much greater investment in local responders would be absolutely indispensable in a world where humanitarian needs continue to far outpace international funding, to the tune of over $15 billion per year, and where global appeals are constantly underfunded. The rationale for investment in local actors was certainly related to value for money, including over the long term, but also touched on other values. Local actors can work much more efficiently in response to emergencies and investments, and the investment in them is required to build that sustainability by connecting today's response tomorrow's preparedness capacity. Increased focus on localization was one of only a handful of game-changing steps that a panel recommended to bridge the humanitarian financing gap over the long term. Local actors also bring advantages when it comes to winning the community's trust. As pointed out in the Edelman Trust Barometer, people in my community were among the most trusted categories of persons in 2020, and people like myself were considered among the most credible sources of information. With this in mind, community-level volunteers like those supporting National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies have some of the best chances of winning this trust of affected persons in their communities. Many international NGOs and UN agencies have realized this and look to directly hire as many local staff as possible. Unfortunately, particularly in a major and protracted response operation, this can have the reverse effect of undermining local capacity, as talented government and local civil society staff are lured away for better paid positions, leaving their local institutions and organizations weaker. This is not the way to strengthen local capacity. There are still major hurdles to overcome. Overall, direct funding to local actors, the majority of it to governments and not civil society, by the way, has barely budged. From 2% of overall humanitarian funding in 2016 to 3.1% in 2018, while less direct funding was estimated that year at 8.74%. Most of the funds they received was through intermediaries, such as UN agencies or INGOs, with consequent added expenses as well as loss of direct communication and understanding between those carrying out the work at the last mile and those paying for it. Local actors complained that they were often treated as subcontractors with little discretion to make use of their knowledge of local needs and traditions, and very little opportunity to obtain support for their long-term capacity. This led to a commitment in the grand bargain to increase funding channeled to national and local responders as directly as possible, removing multiple layers to 25% of overall humanitarian spend by 2020. We are nowhere close. It also calls for an increased investment in their institutional capacity, support their voices in coordination mechanisms, and promote stronger partnerships between international and local responders. None of these goals could be met without significant levels of trust between international and local partners. Together with the Swiss government, we at the IFRC have acted as co-convener of the Grand Bargain Localization Workstream, where signatories are cooperating to support each other in carrying out their commitments. Since 2016, we have seen important progress on some of these commitments, but much less in others. Many donors, UN agencies, and NGOs have been rethinking how they work with local partners, changing policies that get in the way, and piloting new approaches. For example, Italy revised procedures in 2016 and moved to a direct funding relationship with its first local NGO partners. The ACT Alliance changed the rules of its Rapid Response Fund to make it available only to local actors. Mercy Corps ran a capacity building program in Syria through which local partners received remote coaching, mentoring, training, and ongoing support to strengthen their capacity in financial, operational, and programmatic issues or areas. UNHCR changed its policy on providing overhead costs, which has provided INGOs an overhead amount on contracts, but not local civil society organizations, and now they can. Germany and many other donors significantly increased their support to the UN's country-based pool funds with the ambition that many of the funds would increase the number of local actors receiving it. While this has achieved progress in some contexts, but is not across the board, and still has many challenges for local actors to gain direct benefit. Apart from IFRC, which is undoubtedly the largest global humanitarian network, others, particularly faith-based network organizations like ACT Alliance and Caritas, have long devoted themselves to supporting local actors to respond in their own communities. But we also have many things to improve. The IFRC General Assembly last December just adopted a new 10-year strategy committing themselves to a series of transformations, including a major shift of leadership and decision-making to the most local level, particularly to our 165,000 branches where most important services are delivered. During our visits to several demonstrator countries and in regional workshops in Asia, Asia Pacific, Africa, and Middle East, we heard from many local actors who struggled with repeated capacity assessments and heavy due diligence processes, after which they were still often treated as subcontractors. Women-led and women's rights organizations report particular difficulties breaking into humanitarian financing and coordination mechanisms. Donors are leery of risk and worried about the capacity needed to oversee a multitude of new partners. Not all local actors are prepared to act according to humanitarian principles or humanitarian quality standards. International actors worry about how this shift will affect their funding and role in the future. There are still plenty of stumbling blocks on the way to major system change. In the meantime, however, some steps are being taken towards localization, whether the international community wants them or not. After the Sulawesi earthquake in Indonesia, the authorities limited the entry of international actors unless they could find a local partner to sponsor them. With the tables turned, and as reported by the Humanitarian Advisory Group, some international organizations reported radical shifts in their partnership management. Fewer international staff were employed into the partner organizations. In-country partners took strategic and operational decisions, resulting in greater local ownership of the response. The majority of cluster meetings were conducted in Bahasa Indonesia instead of English. International actors were still contributing, but in a different way. As governments grow in capacity and confidence, particularly in Asia, we can expect more to take their cue from Indonesia's experience. Of course, bans on international humanitarian action are not what we are looking for. International responders will continue to have an important role in a more localized humanitarian system, most especially in conflict settings where blocking humanitarian aid is often used as a tool of war. But the turntables in the Sulawesi case show a glimpse of a response that is much closer to the ideal of as local as possible and as international as necessary that many internationals have managed to achieve so far in their own incremental changes to partnerships and coordination mechanisms. In fact, just last week, my day turned a little brighter reading about SOS Sahel, an international NGO working for more than 36 years in Sudan and Ethiopia, that decided it was time to close down the charity as enough local capacity had been built. We need to learn how they arrived at this point and reflect on the role that many organizations that have persisted for decades without significantly supporting leadership by local actors. As someone who began her career from the Global South, founding a national Southern-based hybrid national-international NGO, or a Southern-based international NGO as some called us, that somehow neither fit here nor there, but yet seamlessly able to blend in and learn from all sides. Let me also share my personal reflections and regrets. Local and Southern-based NGOs have to be very careful not to strive to be a mirror image of the more established Northern NGOs. When I founded Mercy Malaysia, I wanted to prove so hard that we were as good as, if not more effective and efficient, as the other established organizations. My colleagues and I worked tirelessly on quality assurance, obtaining then the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership certification ahead of many large NGOs. All this was very important for our internal learning, quality assurance, and commitment to accountability both to donors as well as the people we serve. But one thing I constantly reminded myself and colleagues then was that we should never lose what is precious as local Southern organizations. As an organization born in a multiracial and multi-ethnic country that I come from, our humility, our deep knowledge of culture, our innate ability to easily build relationships with diverse communities, our precious asset and natural ability to listen, understand, and learn from the people we aim to support were crucial building blocks to enable us to deliver the best possible assistance for people and with people. There is no magic formula. Sometimes I felt like the token Southern organization representative, this rather unusual Muslim woman from the Global South, who was a decent communicator, was highly opinionated, and courageous enough to speak out. I'm glad today there are many more who are more visible than me, but the reality is we do not fully represent all the smaller community organizations, the grassroots organizations run by women, or the people affected by conflict and crisis who can themselves self-organize and act. So both international and Southern-based organizations, especially the ones who are often represented in workshops and meetings around the world, need to be humble and acknowledge that we all need to do more to build those bridges and relationships with people, then I dare say, one day, to be able to allow them to lead us. Personally, after a more than 20-year persistent and patient journey and stubborn advocacy, dialogues and commitments to localization are common today. In my lifetime, I have seen the shift we push for actually begin to happen. Looking to the future, I know there will be similarly another hopefully more persistent group of individuals, I hope some of them are in this room, who will push forward and continually transform the system and put trust and power into affected people's hands themselves. And people affected by crisis or caught in conflict will raise their voices more frequently and louder. I urge you to read The Guardian's article published yesterday, appropriately entitled, "Stop Ignoring Us, Rohingya Refugees Demand Role in Running Camps." To achieve this much-needed shift, we will require a completely different funding model and system from what we now widely use in the humanitarian sector. The fast-growing application of fintech, digital social networks, and the ability for people caught in crisis to connect directly with those who want to assist will certainly catalyze this. It is also the action of individuals, like my friend Amira, who crowdsources funding to get much-needed warm blankets for migrants and refugees landing on remote Greek islands and connects to friends on the island and others who have shipping containers and short storage. The private sector will increasingly play a role. We just need to know how to harness and guide the partnerships so that our precious humanitarian principles are preserved. Most importantly, we need to ensure that everything we do will protect the safety and dignity of those we hope to serve. But there are dark clouds looming above us today. A narrowing humanitarian space imposed by governments may result in national and local actors being more able to strengthen preparedness, response, recovery from disasters arising from natural hazards. That's a good thing. However, closing and limiting access to people caught in conflicts is threatening our very ability to reach those most in need and hardest to reach. Added to this, current discourse and increasingly restrictive counterterrorism legislation can cripple humanitarian action. I would never argue that security is unimportant, but we may yet see the negative repercussion of these regulations when people feel they are victimized and forgotten. So how do we maintain trust in humanitarian action? Even in our turbulent times, our principles are still a potent tool and certainly one we will want to protect from permanent damage. We hope that this will be possible even as we stand up for humanitarian values when the political sphere becomes so extreme as to place them in jeopardy. To keep the trust of the public and through them our major donors, humanitarian organizations must maintain best-in-class safeguards against fraud and misuse of funds. We must be transparent and conscientious in our use of resources that are entrusted to us on behalf of those in need. And for this aid to be effective, donors must allow enough breathing space to us to make some of our own decisions about how to use these funds without being buried in over-reporting and paperwork. To turn around President Reagan's phrase, verify, yes, but with some trust. We need to rise to the challenge in trying to maintain trust in an increasingly noisy world, where confirmation bias of artificial intelligence create algorithms that drive greater polarization, where fake news is paradoxically taken more seriously than mainstream news, where social media becomes the first point of news and information, and we need humanitarian actors to diversify skill sets to manage this, to master these digital and media platforms rather than always being on the reactive side. We need to continually engage in ways that might seem non-traditional today, but obsolete in just a few years' time as the rapid speed of change in digital communication and increasingly available technology is available to all. And we must work together to go local. This is where you come in. As I hope you remember, this speech is ending with an assignment for you, because going local requires its own leap of faith at a very distrustful time. If we do not take it, we risk losing the confidence of the communities where we work, the people we seek to help, and the governments of affected countries. Losing that confidence can be just as fatal as closing the spigot of humanitarian funding. What is your role? Some of you, like me, are grand bargain signatories. I'm sure among you here are international actors, and you need to adjust to current and future realities, to be bold, courageous, and adaptable, to foresee what role you are best placed to contribute, and when you might eventually exit. Others of you are current, and my hope, many of you are future thought leaders for our sector. I need all of you. I need all of your help to overcome that most deadly threat of threats to change, humanitarian reform fatigue. We are moving very slowly and painfully towards a more localized approach, where communities are supported to be their own heroes and international support strengthens and enhances rather than replaces and undermines. This is just the moment when many past reforms in our sector have begun to lose steam, when the incremental improvements make the finish line look impossibly hard and far, and people begin thinking about the next catchphrase. We need your voices in your tweets and posts to encourage all of us to keep on going in this race to truly build a system fit for our future, that is empowering and acknowledges the power that people who we see as being on the receiving end are often capable of being innovative, effective, and accountable. I met someone I admire, Sir Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, at the UN General Assembly last year. I lamented to her how it seems so hard to push for reform, and she replied to me, "The size of your dreams must always exceed your current capacity to achieve them. If your dreams do not scare you, they are not big enough." So to paraphrase John Lennon, you can say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I know many of you share the same desire to see not just a better humanitarian system, but more importantly, better outcomes for people who are caught in some of the worst circumstances, merely because they were born in a different place, under different circumstances, not by any choice of their own. We are no better than them, if not for that. If improving our systems and approaches helps us achieve our goals, then let's start by investing in building trust, doing and delivering what we say with humility and perseverance to the very people who deserve that trust, the local populations. And may the force be with us. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, we're going to move up to the judge's bench in this moot courtroom. Again, I want to thank Jemilah for a brilliant speech. I was wondering when she was going to bring the Star Wars reference in, and I was happy that it came at the end. We are, again, I want to acknowledge Rasheen Carlos and the work that she did on behalf of the Permanent Mission, and Johanna Lawton, Camille Giacovis, and the others at the Institute. I want to acknowledge our students, our professors, and our guests, especially the IFRC movement from around the world. So I just wanted to get all the housekeeping out of the way before we do some questions. Johanna and Camille, maybe if we could, the questions will be by card, and then we'll sift through them up at the top. But just remember Jemilah's voice, so we're not going to be long on it. Please watch this space for the next lecture as well. We'll have more of these distinguished lectures all through the spring. So you can refer to the Institute webpage, www.fordham.edu/IIHF. Why don't we, Johanna, why don't we see what you have?
So the first question is, how do you balance localizing with rapid life-saving events? So that's a good question, but let's ask ourselves, when there is an event, like a disaster, an earthquake, or even conflict, who are the first responders? Let's not fool ourselves that it's the international community coming in to try to save lives. It's actually neighbors, it's communities, it's the local Red Cross, it's the local church, it's the local community organizations, and then the international response is mounted. So I'm not saying international response is not important, but the reality is in an acute onset situation, it's usually local groups that are actually helping. So finding that balance is when the needs are much bigger than what is required, and what is available at that point is when international response is usually mounted.
Not so much a question, but just to respond to that, I think you're completely right. And when within the Irish system, when a disaster happens or an emergency strikes, generally our first port of call is the IFRC. When we have to sit down on the first day, something's on the news, the minister says we need to fund the response to this earthquake, to this flood, to whatever, the first thing we will look at is the IFRC appeal, because we know that IFRC money goes to the National Society, who are the people who are already there, and they're working to save their own communities.
So our next question is, what would be your call of action to government donors to push reform?
This is one of the I know there are some government representatives here, and I hope you will all be our champions. But one of the things we're doing, particularly, through, for example, if you look at the localization workstream itself, is getting the members who are signatories to the grand bargain to say, look, we signed on this, we called for this reform in financing, we need to act on it. And it's been very slow, partly because different governments have different bureaucracies and different regulations. This year, from last year, we have now a new eminent person, and she is Minister Sigrid Kaag from the Netherlands. And what she has pledged to do is really start engaging with parliamentarians. I think the audience that we speak to is very important. For many donors, it's taxpayers' money, and they need to be able to justify how that's being used. And I think that, by engaging with parliamentarians, getting them to see what is being done, how the money is being used, and this requires us to really be transparent in our communication, but also to encourage them that nothing is with zero risk, right? There must be some risk taking. So, we keep pushing. The UN certainly through the General Assembly and through OCHA and the humanitarian reform process right now, looking also at the humanitarian development nexus and all the other nexus that they're looking at, is still trying to address this as well. But for me, the reform, yes, it's good. We're going to push for a reform of the system. What I'm trying to stress you today is that one day it'll be people themselves who will be able to reach out and try to get the assistance they need. It's already happening. If you look at some of the disasters around the world, the financial flows in country to people affected, say, by an earthquake in Pakistan or something, far exceeded the humanitarian response funding, because it was diaspora, it was families, it was, businesses outside that were actually helping.
Okay, cognizant of Jemilah's voice failing. I have a couple here that are similar, so I'll read them both, and maybe you can answer them. And then I have another two that are also similar. The first is the potential harms of using AI, artificial intelligence, and algorithms in work being done in the humanitarian sector. And if you would elaborate on the position on how tech will either be used to help or harm efforts. And the related question is the role of technology in achieving the mission of the IFRC as an organization locally on the ground.
So we are not really using AI to make decisions. It's AI that is causing a lot of the algorithms as pushing polarization and the discourse. In fact, there has been a lot of, ICRC has produced some really very good reports about, what is the future of war? Could it just be not human, not humans fighting the war? It could be robots, it could be drones. How then do we react in such a situation for humanitarian actors? What we're saying is that we need to be able to understand that this is the way the evolution of dialogues and about our environment around us is very much driven by a lot of this AI and algorithms. On fintech, I can give you a lot of examples. I think many organizations now are really looking at the application of fintech. I talked to you about cash earlier and the importance of cash. When we started doing cash, it was using vouchers. Now it's, using, say, for example, a MasterCard that is loaded every month. We're doing this in Syria for 1.7 million Syrian refugees, and the total project is 550 million euros each cycle. So being able to have a digital identity is also very important for refugees and migrants, because sometimes they have no other identity, but that card, the assessment, the registration allows them some form of digital identity. Recently as well, a lot of organizations are starting to look at blockchain, the application of blockchain, not just for financial transactions, but much more for managing data, keeping ledgers, transparency, and so forth. We did a very interesting pilot in Kenya where we had a project using cash through a blockchain. Now, at the end of the project, which wasn't a massive amount of money, was so successful, but the community understood what it meant to have that transparency, what it meant to have the data, and what it meant to be connected. They then ran their own community, not a blockchain, but a community project where they would barter goods with each other so that everyone would be receiving some form of food or other needs with each other within the community using the same principles as the blockchain. So I think, more and more now we're seeing fintech, everything on a smartphone. But what we have to do is how do we keep up? Humanitarians traditionally don't have that financial background. So what we're saying is that in the humanitarian sector, we need to diversify the skill sets that we have. For example, in Federation, we are investing in data literacy. You can't talk about fintech or AI without understanding basic data. So they're investing in data literacy for 192 national societies. Smartphone applications where we can actually draw money down through smartphones will be, one of the potential next steps as well.
Okay, so our next sort of grouping is really about NGOs. One question about how is dignity missing, right? Dignity, what is missing when they're dealing with communities? Secondly, the scandals that include gross mismanagement of funds seem to fuel a public distrust of NGOs, so what steps can be taken? And last, have you witnessed, or what you think of ethnocentrism, how it impairs the ability of an NGO to effectively listen to and help a community? So
Okay, there's many.
the three together, I'm going to put them all in front of you.
On the question of dignity, preservation of dignity for people affected by crisis is really about a power balance. Traditionally, NGOs, it doesn't matter if it's international or national or southern, this whole notion that I have power and you don't has led to many of the difficulties that we face in the humanitarian sector. I think that can only be confronted when we actually not just listen, but we allow them to participate and sometimes lead in some of the projects that we do. And also dignity is also about realizing that we don't necessarily know what is needed for them. They may have their own versions of what dignity is. Let me tell you a story. So after there are two stories. One was a woman receiving a cash voucher in Zimbabwe, and she was followed to a shop. And, we wanted to see what was she buying with this cash voucher. You would assume she would buy some lentils or flour or some food needs. She bought a bar of soap and some head lice medicine. And when asked, why did you buy this over food and so forth? And she said, well, number one, my children have head lice, and if I don't treat the head lice, they won't be able to play with other children and they will be ostracized. And the second thing is, we all need to smell good and clean, otherwise people will look down on us. So we never think about these things. In our humanitarian packages, we don't think that head lice medicine is a humanitarian need. But who can decide that, what is a humanitarian need for them? Who decides what is dignity? It's the person who's on the receiving side. The other nice story I must tell you is my boss actually was in Antigua Barbuda after the hurricanes. And he saw this woman coming out of a shop, after receiving her cash, and was so happy. And he said, so what did you buy? And she said, I bought a pair of earrings for my daughter for Christmas. This is so important for her because it's Christmas. Now, that cash gave her so much dignity that she could give something to her daughter that would make her really happy at a time where they had lost everything. So how do you explain dignity? I think you will know it when you feel it, and you'll feel it when you know it, But dignity is about people making choices, their own choices about what they need. And on scandals, I think that transparency and accountability is demanded of us. And, we do hear of scandals, and any scandal is not acceptable. Let me share with you what we did. Now it's 2018, we did an internal audit in the West African Ebola case, and we found out that there was some mismanagement of funds. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to really upset us because these were meant to buy body bags and so forth. What did we do? We went straight to the media and we told them, we have lost this amount of funds. It's unacceptable. We are going to take every legal action to find who did this and how we're going to get the money back, even if it means taking them to court. If it's one of our staff, we will put them in jail. And, donors actually didn't, they were very happy that we did that because they said, And Transparency International did an interview with me, and later Robert Barrington, who's the head of Transparency International in UK, did an interview and said, this is the first time someone has come up so openly to say there's been a fraud. And it's impossible that any large operations will not have fraud. It's impossible, especially in Ebola when you don't have flights going in, you can't monitor and so forth. So he said, this is very important, to accept that there are some risks and to be honest when there's a problem. The problem is when you don't tell and you hide. And I think that on ethnocentrism, I think a lot of, I wouldn't like to blame, INGOs are bad, local are good, because I've seen bad and good on both sides. I think the most important thing is, how much do we take time to try to understand the context and culture. When you are traveling to a country for a holiday, you at least buy a Lonely Planet or 4 Doors, or you go online and you read all these things to tell you a little bit about the country. Now, many humanitarians don't even bother. If you look at the things that are being done in some of these places, right? I mean, when they bring, for example, bringing meat to a Hindu population, or, in Nepal, sending very sexy lingerie to earthquake victims who wonder what it's for, or, sending things which are completely out of context and out of culture. And this is why cash is so important, right? But I think it's about consciously, irrespective of what culture you come from, respecting and acknowledging that your culture is different from others. And you need to make the time, the effort to learn that. But more importantly, listen to your local staff. Most often as well, the power imbalance is also between the international staff and the local staff. But really understanding that the power and the culture knowledge is within the local community and the staff themselves.
There are a lot of great questions, but I think I'm going to give you 2 more.
Yeah.
Okay. What part of the society needs to be more influential in creating the humanitarian agenda? From the bottom to the top, or from the top to the bottom?
I think it's both. I think the bottom has to be much better at advocating and pushing for change. But governments also need to listen and to act, right? And I think if you look at the world today, a lot of governments are very afraid of noise from the bottom. And I think we've got to learn how to harness that, not in a negative way, but how do you build those pressure points and advocacy to states on some of the critical humanitarian issues? There are some things that can be successful through a loud advocacy, but many things through soft and quiet diplomacy. By nature, I'm Asian, so I'm very nervous about confrontation. So quiet diplomacy works for me. I'd rather go behind a closed door and have a chat. If it doesn't work, then I'll get people who are really good at noisy and confrontations to do it, because I'm not good at it. So really finding the right people to play those roles at those times. And I always believe in champions. I always believe that in every government, or almost every government, you will be able to find someone in there with enough authority that you can influence. I've experienced this so many times in my humanitarian career.
So this follows on from that, which is really from, this is a question from one of the students here. Those who were not grand bargain signers and who will one day become thought leaders, what is Dr. Mahmood's advice on how to advance the goal of going local?
I think first of all is to understand what going local means. It's multi-layered, right? It's about going local means respecting, local institutions, local organizations. But for me, most importantly, is people, the people affected by crisis, that they are the ones who are most critical. I do believe, I always tell myself, if I am caught in a disaster or a terrible situation, I don't think I will know how to survive as well as someone who's used to this. Because when you go to some of these places, they get on with life. It's unbelievable. They are innovative. The children can create games and toys from all sorts of things, whereas I'd probably be crying for like a week, figuring out what happened to me. But I think, we underestimate the power of those people because they can be so innovative.
they find solutions. And I think if we just give them a little more trust, a little more incentive, they can actually try to figure out. And this is very interesting in the Guardian article, because the refugees themselves are saying, we have knowledge, we can contribute to the response, but you're completely ignoring us, and you're not, utilizing our services, nor are you providing education to the people who are in the camps. And we are worried about that, right? So I think it's about embracing that, this culture of going local is not negative. It doesn't undermine the role of the international sector. On the other hand, I think it allows a transformation of international organizations, because we all know there are new skills that need to be built. There are new roles that international actors can play.
Well, I think we'll end it there. I'm so grateful to Dr. Mahmood for traveling here tonight in this weather, especially feeling as she's feeling. And I think we've wrung every last spoken word out of her. Thank you all for braving the elements. It has been live streamed. It will be recorded on our YouTube channel. It will be published later as a book. Martin, I don't know if you have any final words, but I'd like to thank everyone.
I'll just add my thanks, Dr. Mahmood, and thanks to those who've come out on this inhospitable evening. So thank you.